Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Global America Business Institute podcast, where we bring you conversations with experts in the field of clean energy. My name is John Christian, the Director of Research and Outreach at GABI. We are excited to be talking with Barbara Tyran today. Barbara Tyran is Director, Macrogrid Initiative at the American Council on Renewable Energy, or ACORE. She is also a Senior Advisor at the Global America Business Institute and is recent General Chair of the IEEE Power and Energy Society 2021 General Meeting Local Organizing Committee, hosting approximately 2,000 delegates from around the world in July 2021. Barbara, welcome. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you so much for having me, John.
Well, let's just dive on in. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got into the field and what are some of the most salient energy issues today?
Surely, I'd be very happy to. Thanks for the question. So when I started in energy, it was at a time when there were enormous gasoline lines in this country, which was a huge concern. The United States was dependent on other nations for its oil and gas supplies. It seemed to me at that time that energy issues were very complex, that they had a profound impact on our domestic economy, and that they also were hugely important for our international relationships. And I would say that thought is still with me today, many years later, that energy is still a huge factor in our domestic economy. It still plays a major role in our international relationships. The issues may be somewhat different now, but the complexity still exists and the trade-offs. And so I can say very happily, after spending my career in energy, that it is a fascinating place to work, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. What is your opinion on the current trajectory of clean energy efforts?
So there's certainly a global awareness around clean energy and many efforts underway around the world to the environmental sustainability. But all of that also, of course, needs to be balanced with the fact that there are billions of people on the planet who don't have access to electricity or have limited access to electricity. So we need to continually maintain some sort of balance between providing access and continuing the other areas, which is environmental awareness, affordability, and reliability and resilience. Always a trade-off.
So when talking about people over the world who don't have electricity, what are some ways that we can actually get them zero carbon electricity, in your opinion?
So many of the resources that are available to people in other parts of the world where they don't enjoy electricity now, it requires them that they are using energy sources that might not be as clean as some that could be provided by other nations. So we need to be sure to be aware of what the pressures are on them, whether that means financial pressures, whether it means access pressures, whether it means international relationships of their own that they need to honor or have made a commitment to. But I think the effort overall is a universal one, which is we will all strive to have access to energy that is clean, affordable, and reliable.
What are some of the obstacles to address when tackling climate change?
That's a great question. Well, certainly in the United States, there are a number of different questions. We're all cognizant of the fact that many electricity power plants last for 40 or more years, oftentimes 60 or 80 years. So to prematurely retire a plant could lead to stranded assets, which would not be a beneficial financial outcome for the organization. Also, if there are retirements or a shift in the generation mix, it could lead to job loss for those whose facilities where they worked were no longer in operation. There are also supply chain issues, and we're certainly seeing that on the international stage now, where supply channels are experiencing a lot of struggles. And there's cost issues. And of course, in the United States, as everywhere, what we're trying to do is to make sure that electricity consumers enjoy affordable electricity and the lowest cost. Again, that's all a question of balance with the other factors If we look at the issue of the obstacles globally, we've talked about the energy access issues. That is clearly important. We should think also about cost when we're talking about the international situation. And then also economic development. Energy provides extraordinary economic development tools. And so that's an important factor to consider, particularly in the places where energy does not exist today.
You touched on several things there, including taking nuclear offline. There have been protests in the 70s protesting the expansion of nuclear power. But in 2021, how aware do you think people are of how their electricity is generated, whether it's coming from natural gas or renewables or nuclear?
That's a good question. I think that many people are aware or try to be aware. Obviously, electrons in the energy system are moving on their own, and so when people say that they have paid for renewable energy, it means that they've made a contribution to renewable energy being a part of the generation mix. It doesn't mean that the specific electrons that are coming into their home or office are necessarily generated by renewable energy, but they are definitely a percentage of the mix that's there. But again, that's one of the fascinating parts of being associated with energy, is that there is no silver bullet. Every single energy source has its pros and has its cons, has its benefits and has its challenges. And many times that's in the eye of the beholder. There are certainly substantive facts that contribute to the pros and cons, but also people have very emotional reactions also to the kind of energy they use and what they consider to be popular. And as you hinted at, John, I mean, there are also people who have concerns, in some cases legitimate concerns, around what they consider to be their generation mix. And we need to understand that and continue a dialogue to help further greater understanding there.
That was really well said, that there isn't a single silver bullet to climate change, and the renewables have ups and downs, and so do other types of zero carbon electricity. You worked at the Electrical Power Research Institute and the United States Energy Association. Both of these organizations have international dimensions. Can you discuss what they have in common?
They are very similar in many ways. Both organizations are 501c3 public interest nonprofit organizations. And a big part of what they do is to try to provide information that can educate energy stakeholders on the technology and technical aspects of energy. And so EPRI is a research organization with some preeminent engineers and scientists who are conducting cutting edge research. USEA is doing wonderful work around the world, providing global energy access and also sharing technical best practices in those other parts of the world, while convening energy stakeholders in the US. And thanks to the global pandemic and the fact that everything is on Zoom now, convening energy stakeholders globally to talk about the advances that are being made at a technological and political and policy level associated with energy. So their educational convening functions, I would say, are very, very similar.
How can we rethink and redesign energy infrastructure?
That's a very timely question. There's so much happening now in infrastructure. As we speak together today, the Congress has just passed infrastructure legislation that's been signed by President Biden. There's infrastructure provisions in the reconciliation bill, the Build Back Better Act, that has been passed by the House. And we also have the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission holding a proposed rulemaking, an ANOPR as they call it, a proposed rulemaking on transmission right now. So I would say transmission infrastructure issues have never been higher on the public awareness scale than they are right now. And to think about this differently or to redesign it, I think it's very important that federal regulators and state regulators have the opportunity to discuss these issues together. They both have authority in this area, and it's important to find common ground. It's delightful that FERC has set up a joint task force on federal state issues associated with transmission. And that task force is comprised of 10 state regulators and the 5 FERC commissioners. And they're committed to meeting with each other and trying to understand each other's perspectives as we shift the plans around how transmission perhaps has been cited and permitted in the past, and how costs have been allocated in the past to potentially a new paradigm.
What factors shape the pathways to resilience?
There are a number of pathways. It goes beyond energy supply diversity, although that's certainly a factor, and also increasing reliability. But interestingly, with transmission in particular, the typical line lasts for a half a century. And so that's a significant investment. But the aspect of transmission that's so important is that with extreme weather events like we've been having over the last few years, a big part of that is that weather events can be quite narrow geographically. And so if customers have access to electricity from beyond their immediate region to another region, then if there are problems locally because of extreme weather, they can access energy thanks to the transmission system from neighboring areas. And that means that there's less loss. It means there's less suffering. It means there's less financial damage. It means that to the extent health is impacted, that people are benefited from having interregional access to energy. And that, of course, provides really the paramount importance of resilience.
So when discussing that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, there are 3 main regions of electricity in the US, the Eastern, Western, and then Texas. So what would we have to do to integrate all 3 into one larger network? Or are you talking international between even like Canada and those places?
So the grid in North America includes Canada. It would be Canada and the United States when we talk about that. You are correct that there are the 3 regions, the Eastern and Western Interconnect, and then ERCOT. What we can do between the Eastern and Western Interconnect is to establish more interregional flows between those 2. Texas has chosen to not be part of that system at this present time, but as with anything, why ideas change and evolve. And so there may be a point in time when the North American grid will be even more holistically connected than it is today.
How does government and industry work together on energy access and environmental issues?
That is very important because it's so needed that government and industry collaborate together on these issues. There are great examples of that happening on a number of different issues. Cybersecurity comes to mind, where there's a great deal of collaboration between the government and industry on those vital issues. Of course, those are so dynamic and at least as far as we can see now, will never go away. So it's just critically important that everyone, all interested stakeholders, stay in touch and form a dialogue around potential solutions to that. One of the objectives of the macro grid initiative, which I'm working on, is to serve the energy needs of all regions and to make sure that energy is available from where it is generated to being delivered to where it is needed. And that, of course, is the vital role that transmission plays in the macro grid initiative, is to be able to make sure that we're optimizing the utilization of those domestic resources. And that is probably the biggest change since when I began my career, as I mentioned at the outset, when we relied so heavily on foreign sources. And of course, the United States has evolved over those years to becoming energy independent.
Let's zoom out a little bit. How do we transition current global energy systems to be resilient in a net zero future?
So I think what we need to think about too is that there are parts of the country, many parts of our country, where not only do they want diverse energy supply needs, but they also are trying to achieve carbon reduction goals. That would be particularly true in California, New England, New York, but they have high population load centers. And so they need a lot of electricity, but they also want to comply with their own sustainability and net zero carbon emissions goals. So one of the real features of this country is that we have in the 15 states between the Rocky Mountains and the Mississippi River, we have 88% of the potential wind potential and 56% of the solar potential. And so it's located in the middle of the country with only 30% of projected energy demand in 2050 being in that part of the country. So much more generation available than demand. But where that can be useful is if that could be then transmitted to the parts of the country, i.e. the two coasts, where the load is much higher, but the resources are not at least currently in existence. And so that will require some planning reforms. But the good news on this front is it does not require any kind of technology breakthroughs. We have the transmission technology today that would enable that to happen if we could plan accordingly.
And that takes us back to talking about energy infrastructure and how a lot of this infrastructure lasts for 50 years or more.
Yes, absolutely, which is almost mind-boggling, but it is true.
Barbara, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, John. It's been a real pleasure talking about energy with you, and I appreciate the chance to be on your program.
Thank you so much for listening to our conversation with Barbara Tyran, Director, Macrogrid Initiative at the American Council on Global Renewable Energy, and Senior Director at the Global American Business Institute. My name is John Christian. We look forward to seeing you next time.